Okay, I just finished reading the Toll like 15 minutes ago, so let's just go over and review the whole series. And to help out some people who haven't got into this series, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why you should read the Scythe trilogy and 3 reasons why it might not be for you. Now, this series has a special place in this channel, even though it's not one of my favorite books or anything. The first video I've ever uploaded on this channel is the review of the first book, Scythe, and that's also currently the longest video on this channel. It's a 30-minute rant review of the first book, so if you're interested in that, I'll leave the link in the description. But this one's going to be spoiler-free. So if you don't know what Scythe is about, Scythe takes place in a utopian world about 300 years into the future. And in this world, the technology is so advanced, people just don't die anymore. And everything is controlled by a super robot AI in space called the Thunderhead, but they left one thing out of reach for the Thunderhead, and that is population control. They left that in the hands of humans. So the way the humans dealt with this was they created a group of people called Scythes, and these people are responsible with killing people to control the population growth. So Scythes just go around their day and just randomly kill people. They all have their specific methods, and the main protagonists are 2 teenagers, Citra and Rowan, who are taken as apprentices to one of the legendary Scythes, Michael Faraday. As you notice, Michael Faraday has the name of a scientist, so in this world, when you become a Scythe, you just leave your old name behind and you take the name of an influential person throughout history. They can take all sorts of names. There was like a Scythe Beyonce at some point. Not to undermine Beyonce's contribution to society, it's not quite on par with someone like Nikola Tesla, but you know, you can pick whoever you think has contributed to the society. Which brings us to the number 1 reason why this book might not be for you, and that is the main premise of the book. Now, when I told you the premise, it might have gone 2 ways. Either you went like, oh, this sounds really cool, or you went like, this sounds incredibly silly. And I'm in the team that thought this was incredibly silly, because to me, this is the absolute worst solution that you can come up with in this situation. And I think it's super obvious that it's a terrible solution. I talked about a bunch of solutions in my original video, but for example, Scythes in this world kill people, which is, by the way, called gleaning in this world. They glean people in various ways to simulate how it used to be in the mortal world, the way the nature intended. But do you know what's the most natural solution? Just stop reviving people. So in this world, people actually do die. They can have accidents. There's actually a group of people who just kill themselves just for the fun of it because they just get revived immediately by super cute robots. But one, just leave people to die, to stop reviving people. And there's another thing, that people can revert back to a younger age. Just let people get old and die. This alone is like a huge way to control population. Just people die naturally. Stop reviving them. Maybe only revive them in like super special situations, like when someone is murdered or something. And another thing is just stop allowing people to have 20 children. If you just limit people to have 2 children and then let them die naturally, you will just reduce your problem significantly. But no, they just came up with like specially trained killers wearing colorful hoodies because that was cooler. So to me, at the core, this book does not need to exist. They could have completely avoided this whole situation, especially in a utopian world where everything is regulated. So this is a world where you can regulate things. Everything works great. Everyone is fulfilled. Anyway, if you cannot get past it, you will hate this book because that's the main premise of the book. That's like a huge part of the series. The way I got over it, well, I was like, okay, humans are stupid. They made a stupid decision and now they have to live with it. That's the way I dealt with it. So I recommend you do that too if you find this incredibly silly. However, as silly as this premise is, it's not the only thing that's going on in the book. Especially in the second and third book, the world expands quite a bit and there are a lot of other things to discover, and I think those things are far more interesting than the main premise. And because the first book establishes the main premise and spends a lot of time on it, it doesn't really talk about it much more in the second and third books. And it introduces a lot of different concepts, it introduces a lot of different characters. Sort of, you can see the fun of it. I think you can enjoy it, which brings us to number 1 reason why you should read this book. Is that this book is fun. It's a lot of fun to read. And the first book is a little bit on the more serious side, but the second and third books have a lighter tone at times. One thing that was challenging for me in the first book was just taking itself so seriously about this premise that sounded so silly to me. I was just not able to stop getting annoyed, but the lighter moments in second and third books kind of made up for it. So I actually enjoyed second and third books more than the first book. The second and third books also introduce a lot of new characters characters, which I enjoyed quite a lot because I was not quite on board with the main protagonist in the first book. Which brings us to number 2 reason why you shouldn't read this book, because I don't think this book has strong characters and it doesn't have strong relationships between them, especially in the first book, because the main characters are completely disenchanted and they don't really want to do anything. It's really hard to be on board with them. But I do think with the introduction of new characters in the second and third book, this is much better. Still, this book has one of the worst villains that you will ever read because it's a completely generic sociopathic maniac of a villain, extremely cartoonish. The villain does not have any interesting ideas that you can be like, oh, like maybe he has a point. He's just incredibly selfish. He just likes killing people. So he's in the right profession and he just wants to enjoy killing people. And even though Scythes have commandments to stop them from being cruel and he just ignores all the commandments, there are no repercussions against him. I'm guessing he's supposed to simulate a fascist leader. The thing about that is just does not have the ideas to appeal to masses. He's not manipulative enough with his ideas. He is a charismatic character, but his ideas are clearly based on selfish reasoning. Unfortunately, that's what it is. That's the villain you get. So again, if you're looking for a complex villain, this is not it. He's not even particularly good at anything. I think he's supposed to be a really competent fighter, but he doesn't really get into a particularly challenging fight or anything. So you don't really see his skills a lot. Because one thing that can make a villain interesting is if the villain has some sort of virtuosity in something, but this guy doesn't. One interesting character is the Thunderhead itself. You meet the Thunderhead in the second book as the book is titled, and his thoughts and his approach is, I think, very interesting and a lot of fun. The Thunderhead obviously is an analogy for a benevolent god, and this is not subtle in this book. Again, this is more apparent in later books, but it is a little bit silly, but the Thunderhead itself is sort of a fun character, so I just went with it. And not that it's a bad analogy, it's just so on the nose. But you know, this book is not subtle. Subtlety is not part of the strength of this book. There are a few other characters that are introduced later, and I think those characters are also fun. But if you like really strong character writing and if you like reading about the relationships they're developing, this is probably not the book for you. But even though the characters are not super deep, because the book does a really good job at introducing new characters and new concepts all the time, it brings us to the second reason why you should read this book, because this book has fantastic pacing. I did see some people saying they were bored reading this book, and I cannot imagine why, because I think this book has incredible pacing. Even when I was like rolling my eyes while reading this book, I was still reading it. Because one, it's really short, the chapters are short, it connects really well from one chapter to the other. The books are around 100,000 words, so you can probably easily read them in 2 or 3 days. And I think it flows. It flows really well. So if you're looking for something quick and easy to read over a weekend, I think these books work great for that. But if you're looking for something deeper and more complex, I don't think these books are for you. Which brings us to number 3, why you shouldn't read these books, and that's world building. This book has considerably superficial world building. It takes place in the future, but I wouldn't call it sci-fi. And it is utopian, dystopian, but not quite in that genre. I would say this is more aligned in fantasy. But even that, like, I'm not expecting super hard sci-fi, but I am expecting some sci-fi. This book takes place 300 years into the future, but the world seems significantly like our world, except for the health benefits. I mean, obviously you don't die, you don't get sick, you can get revived and you can revert back to a younger age. But other than that, there are like roads, there are still sports cars. I mean, there are self-driving cars, but we have self-driving cars now. The ships seem similar to ours, the planes seem similar to ours, the apartments seem similar to ours, the technology generally people use in their daily lives seems very similar to ours. Whereas we know that's not really the case with how technology evolves, right? Think about 300 years before now, like in 1700s, it's a completely different world. And think about 300 years before that, it's like completely different. So most probably the technology will evolve very differently 300 years from now. It will not look at all as our current technology. Even think about the planes 50 years ago and think about the planes now. There's a huge difference. So that kind of difference is not even hinted. It's just the book is just like ignores it completely. You just have to accept that this is a superficial world building. It might not affect your experience a lot. It feels much closer to our time period. You know, it does help understanding how things works a little bit, so you don't need a lot of exposition to explain how things work in this world. I personally found it uninteresting and uninspired. It may or may not be a huge factor for you, but it is what it is. However, despite all these shortcomings, the last reason why you should read it might surprise you, but I think you should read this book if you are a beginner or aspiring writer. The reason is the book starts with this incredibly silly idea, and it doesn't really spend a lot of time trying to nitpick it. It just starts with this kind of interesting, cool idea, and it just goes with it. Whereas I think beginning writers just spend so much time on just trying to perfect their idea. But I think this book proves that even with a flawed idea, you can come up with something that people love, because this book has a huge following. It has been in development for a movie for quite some time now. You know, it doesn't have super in-depth characterization, but it has interesting and fun characters. It doesn't have like a complex world building, but it has enough to just feel like, oh, like this is like a different, interesting world, that things kind of work a little bit differently. And the way the pacing works, the way the book keeps repeating the information in various ways, just keeps you always on board, makes sure you don't miss any information, and does it in a way that's really fun and without interrupting the flow. And I'm not saying this book feels like it's written by a beginner writer, obviously, but what I'm saying is there's a lot to learn just by reading this book. Because I imagine if I wrote this book, I just would not stop criticizing myself so much that I would never release this. But even something this flawed can resonate with people and can still be fun and can still be interesting. So I recommend you give it a shot and read it and check it out just to see how this particular thing has been done. Alright, these were the 3 reasons why you should or shouldn't read Arc of a Scythe trilogy by Neal Shusterman. I'm gonna say at the end of the day, I enjoyed this book. I think it has so many flaws and it just really annoyed me a lot, and I rolled my eyes a lot, and I took quite some time off after reading the first book. I read the second and third books back to back after the third book was released. And I think that was the time I needed to take off because I needed some distance from eye rolling. But I'm gonna say I do not regret reading this book. And overall, as a series, I think all the books have satisfying conclusions. I was satisfied with the overall conclusion, and I was satisfied with the endings of the first and the second books as well. I've been seeing a lot of people who enjoyed the book are hating the toll. I haven't watched any reviews yet because I just finished reading it. So I'm not sure why people hate it so much. But if you like the other books and hated the toll, let me know why in the comments. I would love to know. If you enjoyed this video and if you found it helpful, please leave a like to let me know. And if you'd like to see more numbered bookish lists, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
I am complete. I am